I yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Jacobson.
But I think one of the things that's, and I would say disheartening in this, hearing some of the media reporting and frankly some of my colleagues on the other side of the dais here, is this misdirection of what is happening. There is a persecution of Christians in Nigeria. The witnesses have made that clear. We heard the bishop speak. I don't know how many times we have to hear it or how many reports of martyred Christians, my brothers and sisters in Christ in Nigeria, how many times we have to hear that happen to take it seriously. And one of the things that concerns me is that it feels like at times it's echoing an indifference around this, and somehow we're going to develop our way out of it through developmental programs, and this indifference sounds like echoes of Rwanda to me, where we did nothing on that. And I think, as you remember quite clearly, President Clinton has stated that as one of his largest failures in his administration. President Trump has made a definitive decision to actively engage and stop the killing in Nigeria, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. You all have used a word that I think is very apt in this, and this is prioritization. And as Chairman Smith put it perfectly in his opening statement of this hearing, when he spoke with the senior officials of the Nigerian government, is that we do want to work with them. We have the opportunity here. I think the Nigerians have an opportunity to deepen and strengthen their relationship with the United States if they will prioritize the protection of these communities. Of course, non-Christians are being killed too. We're not saying that's not happening, but there is a systematic targeted campaign that's happening here. I met with that same delegation, same as Chairman Smith did, and some of the feedback we were getting is a little bit of that same misdirection. But let's not turn a blind eye to what's happening. Let's not believe our lying eyes, right? One thing I'd want to point out here is we've had religious organizations and advocacy groups have been calling for humanitarian assistance in the Middle Belt region. And my understanding is that the Tinubu administration has not specifically requested it. That's why it's not there. They just have to ask for it, and our State Department will then provide that assistance to those organizations on the ground. That is a perfect example of prioritization and indifference to what is happening here. So that would be a great, to use your department's term, confidence building measure on the part of the Tinubu government in this, if they are serious about this. Because I can promise you President Trump is. He is very serious about this. A question that I have for you is, the Nigerian Constitution prohibits the ownership of firearms. But somehow, these Fulani militants operating in the Middle Belt of region of the country, they're all armed. And we're not talking about ISIS, we're not talking about Boko Haram. Why hasn't there been some type of move or campaign by the Nigerian government to disarm these militants that are operating there, where we're seeing a lot of this killing that is coming from them? They have access to AK-47s and other small arms to slaughter Christians. Is this something that you've been talking to the Nigerian government about? Because I think it would actually have a serious impact, and it is something that I raised with the Nigerian government officials when we met with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Moore, and thank you also for your service on this task force that will be providing recommendations and your meetings with the Nigerian officials. Appreciate that. I think that this is an excellent suggestion as part of the strategy that we are putting together, in particular to talk about the policing aspect of this and what is happening in the Middle Belt, so that we can focus resources and have specific recommendations on actions that the Nigerian government can take. I very much appreciate that suggestion.
Yeah, it just seems to make all the sense in the world to me. It's like, here we are. I mean, I understand we're not going to get like ISIS to lay their arms down. That's probably more of a kinetic option there that's going to result in their arms no longer being brought up in anger against Christians. But in any event, this seems to be something that, obviously, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is something that they should be doing, they should be looking at. And while I got just a couple seconds left, I would urge the Nigerian government to take a look at pardoning Sunday Jackson, who is an individual who was fighting for his own life, defending his life against one of these Fulani militants. That Fulani militant lost his life in that struggle, and now that person, Sunday Jackson, is facing the death penalty. Now, where's the justice in that? Where is the justice in that? And all these Fulani militants are breaking the law. They are breaking Nigerian law. And so this Sunday Jackson, disarms this person with a knife, protects his own life. He's going to prison and now faces the death penalty. And Falani militants just roaming bands of them with AK-47s, and that's no problem. You are so right about this question of prioritization. I know I'm over time, Mr. Chairman, but I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moore, for your leadership, and do appreciate everybody. Mr. Stutzman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on not only this issue, but so many other issues related to life and to religious freedom. I want to thank the ranking chairman as well, and appreciate the witnesses for being here. Before I begin, I just think it's really important to recognize that what is happening in Nigeria, it's not unique, and that's why religious freedom really matters. It's the core foundation of our Constitution. I mean, I would argue that you can't have economic freedom if you don't have religious freedom. I've been doing some work with the new administration and the changes that are happening in the Middle East and Syria. And, Syria is a very diverse country, and it's so critical for them to have religious freedom and respect. It goes both ways. And I think it's really important, and I think could have a huge impact if Christians and Muslims and Jews and, name all of the religions, if we would all stand together and condemn violence. Condemn this sort of violence that's happening in Nigeria. Condemn the violence that's happening in Soweto in Syria against the Druze and against the Christians and against those that would push back. I appreciate President Trump, who I believe is the strongest diplomat. He's the strongest negotiator, and especially when it comes to religious freedom. He's been willing to call it out around the world, and so we have this opportunity as Americans to really push the importance of respecting religious freedom and it really being part of the fabric of every country. It's also important for us here at home. I mean, not only is religious freedom important around the world, but it's really important for us here at home. I mean, the last thing we want to see is threats to religious liberty in the United States. We need to be the example, and rather than just looking at others. I mean, we have, of course, a very strong, diverse nation as well. One of the things I want to ask and get to is we talked a lot about the tools that the administration has. Senator Cruz and I introduced legislation that would redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And again, of course, very disappointed to see that was revoked during the Biden administration and the steps back that has caused there. I want to ask, Daniel Ada is from Benin. He's as a candidate for president. I just visited with him. He's a friend of mine. I was asking him, since Benin is right next door to Nigeria, what are we seeing in the surrounding areas? Are we seeing some of the same attacks and atrocities in other countries? And is there any sort of coalition? I know the Nigerian government is acting like this isn't happening, but is there any sort of coalition being led by us or within the region to fight back and to push back? I appreciate Mr. Moore's comments about disarming the jihadists and those who are attacking, but is there any discussion about arming the innocent as well, as in making sure that they have the ability to defend themselves with their local law enforcement and is local law enforcement working for them? So a couple of questions in there, but I'd be happy to hear from either one of you.
Thank you, Representative. The security problems, very, very serious ones that exist across the littoral states of Africa are common and are shared, especially in the north, as we see more and more terrorist insurgent action. And so this is a shared problem. We as a State Department, but especially the Department of War and AFRICOM, have focused very heavily on sharing intelligence and trying to create the type of cooperation that you referred to between those countries, so that they're sharing information, using best practices, sharing intelligence with each other to be more effective. In terms of the particular problem that we are discussing today, this targeted attacks against Christians, it is most acute in the middle belt of Nigeria.
One of the things that we know in the Middle East is looking at the curriculums that are taught in schools, and especially some of the curriculum that we saw that was being taught in Gaza to the young children about killing a Jewish soldier is something worthy of. I mean, do we see this sort of education system at all in these countries? Because what are the young people learning? Are they learning to be pursuing peace and prosperity? Or are they also being taught anywhere in these schools some sort of jihadist activity is worthy of accomplishing?
I refer to my colleague from DRL as well, since they publish reports on this that cover some of these issues.
Sure. So you'll see in our human rights reports where we call out human rights violations across countries around the world. In terms of Nigeria's curriculum in particular, I don't have that information right in front of me, but we're happy to report back to you on the committee.
Sure. No, that's fine. I appreciate you both, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.
Thank you for your questions and comments. We are joined by the former chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, who is now over at the Energy and Commerce Committee, James, and I want to thank him. February of 2024, he had a very important hearing on Nigeria and other advocacy throughout that time. So the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your personal invitation, for your leadership, and for your friendship. I'm honored to be back. Psalms 96:14 asks, "Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against evildoers?" Nigeria is facing one of the gravest religious freedom crises in the world. As the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Africa, I have visited and have seen firsthand the direness of the conditions in what is now the deadliest place on earth to be a Christian. They are targeted, displaced, and killed simply for their faith. The ancient plea, "Is there no help for the widow's son?" still echoes today. Since 2019, nearly 17,000 Christians have been killed. In the first 7 months of this year alone, hundreds more were murdered. On June 13th, during the Yellowater massacre, more than 280 Christians were slaughtered in a single day. These are not isolated tragedies, but a sustained pattern of religiously motivated violence, often ignored or even enabled by the Nigerian government. Extremist groups like Boko Haram, Fulani militants, and ISIS West Africa attack often without any meaningful intervention from authorities. The lack of response has created an atmosphere of impunity where Christians continue to live in constant threat and fear. The United States has previously recognized this crisis. President Trump not only designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern during his first term, but redesignated it again in his second term after President Biden inexplicably removed that designation. Religious persecution is tied to political repression and weakening institutions in Nigeria. Example, the detention of nnamdi Kanu is a clear example. In 2022, Nigeria's Court of Appeal struck down the charges against him and ordered his release. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has also called for his unconditional release. Yet he remains in solitary confinement, in deteriorating health, and recently had to represent himself in court. Nigeria has signaled that the law is optional and targeting Christians is fair game. Just hours ago this morning, despite the pleas and cries of the Nigerian people and many Nigerian lawmakers, nnamdi Kanu was convicted on all charges. For fiscal year 2025, the U.S. has requested nearly $8 billion for sub-Saharan Africa. But when Americans see political prisoners, judicial defiance, and the slaughter of Christians, they understandably ask as they meet their own struggles, why should our tax dollars support governments that refuse to protect their own people? Is our aid aiding a genocide? Nigeria is a nation of tremendous potential, but that potential is being choked out by violent persecution of its Christian population. No country can build a stable future where churches are burned, believers are killed, and communities live in fear. The United States must stay engaged, and Nigeria must change course now. Mr. Pratt, a direct question. Do you believe, in your professional assessment, that the government of Nigeria has been infiltrated by jihadists?
I do not believe that the government of Nigeria has been infiltrated by jihadists.
Okay, because when you look at the selective enforcement of the rule of law, one might question if there are any favoritism or looking the other way when groups are being specifically targeted, despite the fact, as my colleague Mr. Moore mentioned, not enforcing the rule of law with regard to weapons. My next question. How has the Nigerian government reacted since President Trump's country of particular concern designation announcement?
They have taken the designation very seriously. There is a senior delegation here now. They will meet with the most senior officials of the U.S. government this week, and we have already demarched the government in Abuja and here in Washington on the action plan, and I can say that the results so far have been positive in terms of cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs and members of the committee for holding this very important hearing. The debate about CPC designation for Nigeria began in earnest in Washington last spring after you, Mr. Chairman, had introduced a resolution that urged CPC designation for Nigeria, as you had previously done in 22, and when this subcommittee held a pivotal hearing on the case for Nigeria CPC designation last March. Thankfully, President Trump listened, and he made his decision based on two criteria. One, under the International Religious Freedom Act, that these were severe violations of religious freedom, and that the government of Nigeria, President Tinubu, was either actively engaged or tolerating these violations. Those are the criteria of the IRF Act. So Nigeria's multifaceted terror problem that has had a devastating impact on both Muslims and Christians alike is well known, but the long overlooked persecution of Nigeria's Middle Belt Christians by Fulani jihadi militias finally got Washington's attention when that March hearing was held, and Bishop nnamdi testified. The bishop gave startling firsthand testimony that described frequent raids on farmlands of his Makurdi diocese by armed Fulani Muslim herders who kill, rape, or kidnap residents, all the while shouting the jihadi battle cry, Allahu Akbar. Bishop nnamdi, who testified today as well, and I'm honored to be part of this hearing with him, related that 20 parishes in his diocese have been shut down because of these attacks. Moreover, he said, Nigeria's government was doing nothing to stop this. I agreed in my testimony then that Nigeria should be designated a CPC precisely because the relentless and systematic Fulani attacks targeting Middle Belt Christians are carried out with complete government impunity. By contrast, the government is fighting the terror groups in the north. So this is really key to understanding why CPC is warranted in this case. The bishop's frank testimony required heroic courage. He soon began receiving death threats. A few weeks later, Fulani militants attacked his home village and massacred 12 of his relatives and scores of others. The priest directing his Justice and Peace Office, who took the body counts and came to the aid of survivors in such attacks, has been forced to take temporary leave after credible threats to his life. Mr. Chairman, you and White House officials who had met with Bishop nnamdi were appalled when you heard of this. The attack was part of the brutal pattern seen in hard-hit Benue and various other Middle Belt states, but it also raised the concern that this attack was in reprisal for his testimony to Congress, one organized not simply by nomadic herders, but by those in Nigeria who are close observers of Washington. 2 weeks after that incident, Yelawada, which is, by the way, only 5 miles from the state capital of Makurdi, that's Benue State, was hit by a large Fulani raid. Others have spoken about that. Over 270 Christians were murdered, and the victims included some who had been displaced from their hometowns by prior Fulani raids and had sought refuge in Yelawada because there's a military garrison there. The Nigerian troops there did not put up a fight against the dozens of, and it was only dozens, of Fulani attackers who swarmed in on motorcycles and some on foot, wielding assault rifles and machetes as their weapons. This has been going on for years, again with government impunity. Similar attacks are taking place elsewhere in the Middle Belt. To give one recent example, Catholic priest Father George Dogo told the outlet Truth Nigeria, which is directed by former State Department official Douglas Burton, that 10 days ago in Taraba, Fulani militants stormed through a local government area, indiscriminately killing 20 people and burning and damaging homes and churches. A survivor, Christiana Joseph, a 33-year-old farmer from Amadu village, told Truth Nigeria that as she was preparing to go to early morning mass, a Fulani militia arrived on motorcycles and shot into her house. She is quoted stating, "They fired for about 5 minutes, shouting Allahu Akbar. When the gunfire stopped, I went inside and found my husband of 14 years, John Joseph, already dead." Survivor Samson Haruna also stated that attackers on motorcycles with AK assault rifles strafed houses in his neighboring village. He said, "My neighbors, David Bawa and Titus Gregory, lost 5 family members between them. My house was riddled with bullets." According to the Truth Nigeria report on this Taraba attack, quote, "The Fulani militants that attacked were led by warlord Alhaji Tukur, according to community leader Usa. Wakori Diocese Bishop Mark Nzukwen called the crisis overwhelming and said that 335 Catholic churches have been destroyed and more than 300,000 Catholics there have been displaced beginning in 2015. That's just in his diocese. According to the head of a local security consultancy, Fulani militants plan and stage their attacks from an abandoned resort now overgrown with vegetation called Damjuma Farm that the Fulani use as a cover for cattle grazing, he said. That's the head of this security agency. But that's just a smokescreen. And he commented that if the government wants to stop the attacks, they must clear out the terrorists from Damjuma farms. In a Daily Post Nigeria article, Reverend John Lekau, the director of social communications for the Wakuri Diocese, that's the same diocese that I've been talking about, described the situation as devastating, revealing that many rural parishes have been abandoned following sustained assaults that have claimed multiple lives and destroyed entire villages. Bishop Nzukwen told the respected ACI Africa outlet last year that, quote, if peace is restored, the region's rich agricultural landscape could provide a prosperous future for its residents. Instead, he said, there is food scarcity because of these constant attacks. And there are countless reports like this across the Middle Belt. I mention this one because it shows that Abuja has failed to act even when the Fulani aggressors are identified and their base from which they launch repeated attacks are known. This represents not only a horrifying pattern of severe persecution by Fulanis targeting largely Christian areas, but also a shocking pattern of government tolerance of this persecution. I want to give one last example from Plateau State that occurred a month ago. The Reverend Ezekiel Dechomo of Plateau, who's the regional chairman of the Church of Christ in Nations, told journalists in Jos on October 24 that Islamic extremists have threatened to murder him from calling on the Nigerian and U.S. governments to help protect Christians against genocide. He told the Christian outlet Morning Star News, quote, my life is in grave danger. Even as I speak, I am on the lookout for attacks. I no longer sleep with my eyes closed. I have been attacked before but escaped. The threats came after he appeared in a video on October 15, standing in a mass grave containing the remains of a dozen slain church members, reportedly killed by Fulani herders. And Mr. Chairman, there have been hundreds of priests and pastors killed in the last 15 years, targeted. Not as the State Department reports that they were walking alone or unguarded on a road at night, but they've been attacked and killed in their rectories, homes, and inside their churches. As the Nigeria government issues denials and watches passively, with no Fulanis prosecuted and no Nigerian forces prepared to defend the vulnerable, the Christian death toll from Fulani militia attacks alone, leaving aside the terror attacks from Boko Haram and ISWAP and the others, is in the thousands, and Christian survivors in displacement camps number in the millions. The respected research group Open Doors cites Nigeria as now the world's most dangerous country for Christians because of their religion. Again, at this time, most Nigerian Christians are being murdered by Fulani militias, and they are the militia's special target. Aid to the Church in Need reported last month, quote, and this is the Pontifical Foundation that says this, Nigerian Christians in the Middle Belt are bearing the brunt of violent attacks from those identified as Fulani militants. Some insist that the violent aggression by the Fulani herders against the Christian farmers on their own land is the unavoidable result of climate change. The State Department Religious Freedom Reports have annually described these indiscriminate mass killings as clashes between two socioeconomic groups who fight over scarce resources brought on by climate change. Religion has nothing to do with it, they claim. This justification of Fulani violence has recently shifted. Now it is generally acknowledged that Christians are being murdered in cold blood, but it is being argued that more Muslims are killed in the violence, and this proves it has nothing to do with religion, they say. This argument is not factual, and it is irrelevant for CPC. The premise that more Muslims than Christians are killed is debatable, as the scholarly Observatory for Religious Freedom in Africa documents. In any case, most Nigerian Muslims live in the north, where Boko Haram and a plethora of ISIS and al-Qaeda-linked Islamic terrorist groups attack them and non-Muslims alike, and this violence, too, is religiously based. However, significant for CPC criteria, the Nigerian military is actively fighting those terror groups in the north. By contrast, in the Middle Belt, where most of the Christians are being killed in recent years, and where Christians are the special target of Fulani herder militias, the government isn't lifting a finger against the Fulani militants. Instead, it is tolerating them and denying it is happening. I've also heard about sporadic Christian attacks on Muslim villages. To the extent that the government is not taking action in those cases, that is further reason for CPC designation. Political momentum to list Nigeria among the world's worst persecutors gained throughout October as the annual CPC review neared the year-end deadline, and reports of massacres kept coming. On October 21, the Pontifical Foundation, Aid to the Church in Need, issued its world survey that reported, quote, the number and ferocity of the attacks on Christian villages in the Middle Belt have led some experts to conclude that these incursions are a deliberate land grab to remove Christians and Islamize the region, end quote. Various high-level White House officials in the State Department were also hearing from groups of religious freedom activists on Nigeria. Later that week, President Trump made the CPC designation. For the first time, the issue of Fulani militias Targeting Christians for mass murder received official U.S. acknowledgement when Secretary Rubio addressed this. This, in turn, got the attention of Nigeria's President Tinubu, who said he is willing to work with the U.S. Until now, he has not shown the political will to stop this Fulani violence. CPC, as you know, is a two-step process. The next step in this process requires the president to adopt a policy response. And we heard today from the State Department about what is being considered. And there are several actions that I also endorse. One is to, it's been raised before by Representative Moore, and it's my first recommendation, disarm Fulani herders. These militias are loosely organized. They don't have explosives or drones, don't use tunnels, suicide vests, or propaganda films. They are an unsophisticated, but nevertheless lethal force because they come armed with AK-47s and 49s, while their targets have only homemade pipe bombs to defend, pipe guns to defend themselves with. Assault rifles, such as those used by the Fulanis, are heavily regulated by Nigeria's Firearms Act and illegal for the targeted Christian farming villages. The act specifically only allows homemade what are called Dane guns, cap guns, and another muzzle-loading guns. The act thus outlaws the firearms that would match the assault rifle firepower of Fulani militias and leaves the peaceful Christian communities essentially defenseless. President Tinubu should order the removal of Fulani heavy weapons, raiding their encampments at Dan Juma Farm in Taraba and other places in the process. He should direct the powerful cattle breeders associations, such as the Mayeti Allah Cattle Breeders Association, to cooperate in doing this. Two, fortifying targeted areas. So U.S. foreign aid in Nigeria in recent years has amounted to about $1 billion annually. Areas targeted by these Fulani militias should receive some of this aid to securely return home and reclaim their properties, rebuild, and defend themselves. For example, this aid could go toward intelligence sharing, the training and equipping of local private security guards, as well as other measures. Again, the Fulani militias are not the formidable foes seen in ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and their attacks could be prevented relatively easily, prevented and defended against by these basic measures. Humanitarian aid is important, and this should be for the victims of Fulani herder militia attacks, and this should be distributed through trusted local providers, including through the churches on the ground that are currently one of the main aid providers to the survivors of these attacks. And it's just, again, tragic and ironic that productive farmers now need food aid since they have been driven from their Middle Belt farms. 4, sanctions against those aiding, abetting, and granting impunity to the Fulani herding militias, including those sanctions should include high-level officials in the criminal justice system and the military. The U.S. should gather intelligence regarding official responses to the Fulani herder militias and review possible visa and Magnitsky sanctions for those aiding and abetting. The Fulani warlords' names are known or knowable. Out of all the, I think it's important to understand that out of all the violent attacks by Fulani herder militias, there have been only a few arrests. One involved the prosecution of a Fulani herder who was convicted of destroying melons at a melon company who received a 10-year sentence. It shows the government can get tough when it wants to. And 2 high-profile legal cases of violent attacks on Christians have seen movement in recent months. One concerns the Catholic Church of St. Francis in Ondo, where terrorists killed some 40 worshipers on Pentecost Sunday in 2022. Depositions are being taken in that case. Ondo's bishop recently told me, but the trial has not yet started. It's important to note that's not in the Middle Belt, it's in the South. The 5 suspects being held are said to be part of the East African Shabab terror group and are not members of the Fulani herder militia. The other case involves the Yelawada massacre itself, where charges are have been filed against 5 Fulani herders in September in an extremely rare example of prosecution that I believe is attributable to the pressure raised by the CPC debate in Washington. Finally, the International Religious Freedom Act suggests as a possible policy response to CPC designation a binding agreement with the country to prevent further violence. So I think that is something that should be considered as well. Unfortunately, President Tinubu hasn't shown the political will so far to direct the police and military action within his power. And he argues that because the police force is centralized under the Constitution, he is overwhelmed. He says that a constitutional amendment is required to give back policing power to the governors of the states, and that could take years. However, right now there exist legal ways he can shore up defenses within the targeted Christian areas. For example, decentralizing police commands internally, or empowering local guards, or deploying more mobile police units to states, and prioritizing referrals of state governor police orders for presidential review. So I suggest that the U.S. enter into a binding agreement with Nigeria to ensure this needed police protection against the Fulani militias. Since President Trump's CPC designation, I note some Nigerian officials, including generals of a force in the southern state of Ondo, who cite worries about securing Nigeria's wide open border, already asked for U.S. partnership in an effort to quote, help flush out Fulani ethnic militia terrorists from the Southwest. Thank you.
Ms. Shea, thank you so very much for that very...
One of the things that we know in the Middle East is looking at the curriculums that are taught in schools, and especially some of the curriculum that we saw that was being taught in Gaza to the young children about killing a Jewish soldier is something worthy of. I mean, do we see this sort of education system at all in these countries? Because what are the young people learning? Are they learning to be pursuing peace and prosperity? Or are they also being taught anywhere in these schools some sort of jihadist activity is worthy of accomplishing?
Refer to my colleague from DRL as well, since they publish reports on this that cover some of these issues.
Sure. So you'll see in our human rights reports where we call out human rights violations across countries around the world. In terms of Nigeria's curriculum in particular, I don't have that information right in front of me, but we're happy to report back to you on the committee.
Sure. No, that's fine. I appreciate you both, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.
Thank you for your questions and comments. We are joined by the former chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, who is now over at the Energy and Commerce Committee, James, and I want to thank him. In February of 2024, he had a very important hearing on Nigeria and other advocacy throughout that time. So the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your personal invitation, for your leadership, and for your friendship. I'm honored to be back. Psalms 96:14 asks, "Who will rise up for me against the wicked? Who will take a stand for me against evildoers?" Nigeria is facing one of the gravest religious freedom crises in the world. As the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Africa, I have visited and have seen firsthand the direness of the conditions in what is now the deadliest place on earth to be a Christian. They are targeted, displaced, and killed simply for their faith. The ancient plea, "Is there no help for the widow's son?" still echoes today. Since 2019, nearly 17,000 Christians have been killed. In the first 7 months of this year alone, hundreds more were murdered. On June 13th, during the Yellowwater massacre, more than 280 Christians were slaughtered in a single day. These are not isolated tragedies, but a sustained pattern of religiously motivated violence, often ignored or even enabled by the Nigerian government. Extremist groups like Boko Haram, Fulani militants, and ISIS West Africa attack often without any meaningful intervention from authorities. The lack of response has created an atmosphere of impunity where Christians continue to live in constant threat and fear. The United States has previously recognized this crisis. President Trump not only designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern during his first term, but redesignated it again in his second term after President Biden inexplicably removed that designation. Religious persecution is tied to political repression and weakening institutions in Nigeria. Example, the detention of nnamdi Kanu is a clear example. In 2022, Nigeria's Court of Appeal struck down the charges against him and ordered his release. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has also called for his unconditional release. Yet he remains in solitary confinement, in deteriorating health, and recently had to represent himself in court. Nigeria has signaled that the law is optional and targeting Christians is fair game. Just hours ago this morning, despite the pleas and cries of the Nigerian people and many Nigerian lawmakers, nnamdi Kanu was convicted on all charges. For fiscal year 2025, the U.S. has requested nearly $8 billion for sub-Saharan Africa. But when Americans see political prisoners, judicial defiance, and the slaughter of Christians, they understandably ask as they meet their own struggles, why should our tax dollars support governments that refuse to protect their own people? Is our aid aiding a genocide? Nigeria is a nation of tremendous potential, but that potential is being choked out by violent persecution of its Christian population. No country can build a stable future where churches are burned, believers are killed, and communities live in fear. The United States must stay engaged, and Nigeria must change course now. Mr. Pratt, a direct question. Do you believe, in your professional assessment, that the government of Nigeria has been infiltrated by jihadists?
I do not believe that the government of Nigeria has been infiltrated by jihadists.
Okay, because when you look at the selective enforcement of the rule of law, one might question if there are any favoritism or looking the other way when groups are being specifically targeted, despite the fact, as my colleague Mr. Moore mentioned, not enforcing the rule of law with regard to weapons. My next question. How has the Nigerian government reacted since President Trump's country of particular concern designation announcement?
They have taken the designation very seriously. There is a senior delegation here now. They will meet with the most senior officials of the U.S. government this week, and we have already demarched the government in Abuja and here in Washington on the action plan, and I can say that the results so far have been positive in terms of cooperation.
The Nigerian government needs to do more to address this issue themselves, but what measures are being taken to assist Nigeria to increase its focus on persecution, particularly in the Middle Belt?
Yeah, so thank you for your question, Congressman James. As you mentioned, the Middle Belt is a particular concern. That's where Christians, you mentioned Yalawada, where 250 or 280 Christians were killed, massacred. They were targeted because they were Christians. Churches have been burned there. There have been internally displaced people there. And so we're reviewing all options at the State Department, including Chairman Smith, you mentioned in our bureau, we have Global Magnitsky Act sanctions. We have other tools at our disposal as well to make sure that Nigeria, the Nigerian government gets the message that we are serious about the persecution of Christians and other communities as well, but particularly Christians right now who are suffering disproportionately in the Middle Belt.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me again. God bless you, and good luck. I'm here for you.
Thank you so very much, Chairman James, and thank you again for your great service. I'd like to, between the ranking member and I, we're both going to ask one more question and then go to our next panel. I would like to yield mine to my good friend, Mr. Hozenga, who asked a very serious question about the IDPs in Benue, and if there's any answer that you wanted to give and the tyranny of the clock precluded that, please feel free to do so, and then I'll yield to my friend and colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you yielding to me, and I think you saw my passion on this earlier, but there are serious issues, and part of that interview from Arise TV, one of the other questions to me was, well, doesn't the CPC damage Nigeria economically in a way that is going to disincentivize economic growth and foreign companies coming into the country? And my answer to them was actually, I think the current state of violence is as much a deterrent of a foreign company or a U.S. company coming into Nigeria. And I know the goal of the CPC is to correct behavior, but could you explain a little bit exactly what you would expect to see out of a CPC and what sort of changes it might bring? And then I want to address the 1.4 million who are considered the internally displaced people, IDPs, in Benue, and what the game plan would be to provide the IDPs in Benue and Taraba, what sort of assistance they can depend on from the U.S.
Thank you very much, Representative. This CPC designation, we hope, will focus the energy of the government of Nigeria, as well as our own government here, on all of the tools that we have available. And so by setting up this task force that I referred to and looking at all of the types of assistance that we can bring to bear, but more importantly, what the government of Nigeria can do to own this problem and improve security for all Nigerians, but in particular, tackle this problem that we're talking about.
But they have to admit there's a problem first, right? Okay, and I think that's been one of my concerns is I have not seen an actual admission to this being a problem. It's been given excuses and veneers of a lot of other issues that get parroted both here and in the media. Can you talk about the displaced persons and the help that they could be expecting?
On displaced persons, we do have programs that address this, and we want to make that part of the action plan that we are working on. My colleague from DRL may want to provide more in particular on IDPs.
Sure. As Ambassador Pratt just mentioned, the State Department is reviewing options to help IDPs. You mentioned what actions we want to see from the Nigerian government. That includes, as we've mentioned here several times, prosecutions of perpetrators.
Amen.
That includes reduced violence in the Middle Belt. And that includes
Against all.
Against
right?
all, exactly.
Christians, moderate Muslims, anybody who is not being targeted. Right?
Exactly right. So the Trump administration stands firmly for the principle that religious freedom is for all religious communities and those who don't practice a faith. It is a per se good, and we're committed to helping protect communities all around the world who are experiencing religious persecution, not just in Nigeria, not just Christians. At the end of the day, we want the number to be 0 in Nigeria. We don't want any religious persecution to happen. We don't want it to just be a reduction in violence. We want there to be 0 people who are murdered because of their faith.
Amen to that. Corruption continues to undermine Nigeria's institutions, including those tasked with protecting civilians sometimes. I've heard from some of these instances and conversations I've had with religious leaders in Nigeria who don't feel that the Nigerian government is equipped to respond to the crisis. How does corruption within the security forces hinder the government's ability to prevent and respond effectively to religiously motivated violence?
I mean, corruption is a major problem globally and in Africa and in Nigeria. I think that it erodes capability, right? It erodes the confidence of the forces, especially at the working level. If they see that their superiors are engaged in corruption, that totally undermines the whole enterprise.
And I assume that that is part of State Department's and this administration's action plan that they want to see out of the Nigerian government.
Absolutely.
The Tinubu government is a crackdown on corruption.
To be more effective, absolutely.
All right, thank you. Time has expired. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Thank
gentlemen.
you very much. Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. I yield to Mr. Apple.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Jacobs, for yielding. I think this has actually been a good discussion on this committee and an important one around what strategy we use to eliminate violence against any community. And I think the issue for me is that if you define the problem as people being attacked only because of their religion, that would lead you to one set of solutions. If you define the problem as people being attacked for other reasons, it would lead you to a different set of conclusions and strategies. And I think, Ambassador Pratt, I resonated when you said we have lots of tools in the toolbox. One of those tools is just around the kind of assistance we give to efforts that are cross-faith, interfaith, cross-cultural, building the kinds of ties that we need to build. Because I think this is not a religious oppression Olympics. We're not trying to say one religion is worse oppressed than another. We're saying, how do we get to that ending point that we all agree on, that there shouldn't be violence against any of these communities? And so I guess I want to ask you about programming that specifically promotes interfaith or cross-cultural dialogue. The foreign assistance review that was conducted earlier this year actually this administration cut many of those types of programs, and there are suggestions that there's going to be even more cuts that focus on these kinds of programs. One of the ones I was looking at very carefully that I know is Nigerian Youth Care, and that's one that provided Nigerian youth with mentorship and training on how to bridge religious and cultural divides. Given the administration's concerns about religious conflict and some of the shared goals we've articulated, can you explain why that contract was canceled?
Thank you for your question, Representative. So there is ongoing programming in Nigeria that addresses some of the issues that you've raised. Our early warning, early response programs, for instance, also have kind of an interfaith dialogue built into them. We've seen great success from people who have experienced the program, saying that they have increased, they've seen greater tolerance amongst their communities, et cetera, et cetera. So we have effective programming. Broadly, in terms of foreign assistance, the Trump administration is reviewing every foreign assistance dollar, not to cut, but to make it more effective. We've reprioritized, we've reshaped foreign assistance in a way not to eliminate foreign assistance, but to make it more strategic. The United States has been the most generous partner around the world of any country for foreign assistance. Secretary Rubio has said we will continue to be the most generous country. So I'm happy to share some of the programming success we've seen and get back to you on those answers.
I would appreciate that. And if you can look into this one in particular, and I might send you a few others, because I think that if you say that you're only going to focus on a particular kind of program and you say some of these things are not effective, my work overseas in all of these countries says that some of this work takes time to develop the kind of leadership that is not going to be divided down the road. And so it may not have the same metrics of success immediately that you see, but I think many of these programs really do prove to be extremely important in the long term. And so I just would like to know, what is the status of each of those U.S.-funded programs related to religious tolerance. If you could share a list of that with me, I would really appreciate it. And what new assistance programs should we expect that the administration, maybe you can speak to this part, that the administration is going to promote? That's the second part of the question. And then the third part of the question for you is, I am concerned about some of the reports I'm hearing that certain programs are just going to be cut because they focus on particular communities, or they, are framed in a way that somehow is part of some sham DEI initiative. And so maybe you could speak to those last two and get me the list of the first one.
Sure. So I'm happy to follow up with the committee on specific program we have across Africa. The administration is committed to using its foreign assistance effectively and strategically, and gets the most bang for its buck for American taxpayers, because ultimately we're responsible to the American taxpayers. So in terms of programming, I'm happy to get you the specific answers that you're looking for. In terms of the other questions you raised about specific communities being having greater assistance, I forget how you phrased it, more targeted programs. We want religious freedom for all communities, full stop. We don't want religious freedom for some communities. We want religious freedom for all religious communities, including those who don't practice faith. We think it's a violation of a moral law that somebody is killed because of their faith. We see that happening in all parts of the world, and the Trump administration is committed to helping countries take ownership of their own issues and actually go after people who persecute Christians and Muslims and people of all faiths, and actually shift the responsibility to where we want to help partner with these countries, but at the end of the day, the countries themselves have an obligation to protect religious freedom in their countries. And we're committed to do that.
I agree with you on what you said. I just would say I'd like to see the data that backs up what you're saying, and why certain programs that seem very much in line with what you're saying are being canceled. So I appreciate your attention to this, and we'll follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Thank you. Thank you both for your testimonies, but above all for your leadership. It's extraordinary. And so thank you, and we'll move on to our second panel. Thank you. I'd like to now welcome to the witness table. And we will show a very short video that was just taped yesterday from Mrs. Akpen, I should say, a survivor of the Yellowwater massacre. She lost 5 of her children, and it's just one example of the incredible heartbreak of being slaughtered because she's a Christian, because her family was a Christian. And that'll be showing in 1 second. But if our witnesses could come to the table. Maybe put the video up. Okay. We'll come back to the video in a minute. Let me introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning with Nina Shea, a senior fellow and director at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Ms. Shea has been a human rights lawyer for over 30 years. She works extensively for the advancement of individual religious freedom and other human rights in U.S. foreign policy as it confronts an ascendant Islamic extremism that we're seeing in Nigeria, for example. And I want to thank her for her leadership. Make no mistake, these ongoing attacks are based on religion, and diverting attention from it denies what we have seen with our own eyes. Yeah, there may be other factors, but religion is driving this. Kill the infidel. We see it in other places, and we're seeing it now, sadly, in Nigeria, and it's been going on for many, many years. 13 years ago, in this room, 2012, I chaired a hearing focusing on the slaughter of Christians by Boko Haram, and the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Johnny Carson, testified at that hearing and said, and I quote in part, that the phenomena of Boko Haram is one of discrediting the central government in power for its failure to deliver services to the people. I asked him at the time, are you kidding? I responded by asking why Boko Haram abducts and rapes Christian girls and uses force and coercion, even death, to convert Christians to Islam. On a trip to an IDP camp in Jos, I met many survivors. One man who we had testify here, named Adama, who they took him out of his house. His wife was screaming, please don't hurt my husband. They put a AK-47 to his cheek and said, you renounce your faith or we'll kill you. He said, well, I'm ready to meet my Lord. They asked him again. He repeated that, and they shot him. They blew his face very, very horribly. He survived. And when I met him, I invited him to come and testify. He did. And he said, you've got to realize who Boko Haram is and stop this idea, this is my words, but his sentiment of denial, of saying, it's nothing to see here. So I asked Johnny Carson further, why won't they designate Boko Haram, at least, if not a CPC country, as a foreign terrorist organization? And he said they don't believe it. They're not a foreign terrorist organization. I worked on that for 3 years, additional hearings. On the day I was marking up my bill, and it was called the Boko Haram Terrorist Designation Act of 2013, to put Congress on record demanding an FTO designation, that day the administration declared Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. I was very happy with it, but we could have done that 3 years earlier, maybe had found out what their sources of weapons and funding and everything else might have been, thereby, again, mitigating some of the harm. For too long, the world has looked away, a culture of denial, as radical Fulani militants, Boko Haram, and ISIS West Africa have waged a relentless campaign of terror, murder, and displacement across Nigeria, including the states of Plateau, Benue, and Kaduna. According to Open Doors, and I just want to say something about Open Doors, I've worked with Open Doors for 40 years. I knew the founder, Brother Andrew, an absolutely honest and committed man, and that organization to this day continues to speak truth to power all over the world, including in Nigeria. Well, they have said, Open Doors, more Christians are slaughtered in Nigeria than anywhere else in the world. I co-chair the China Commission. I just left a hearing that we're holding over on the Senate side on religious persecution there, against everyone, against the Falun Gong, against the Christians, against the Buddhists in Xinjiang, not the Buddhists, the Buddhists in Tibet, and the Muslims in Xinjiang. And while they kill many, they incarcerate and harass more than they slaughter. These groups in Nigeria are doing just that, slaughtering. Another group has said over 52,000 Christians in Nigeria have reportedly been targeted and killed by Islamist extremists, while approximately 34,000 moderate Muslims have been murdered as well since 2009. And, that is less focused upon. I raise it every time, and I hope we all will. They're killing those who don't conform to the radical Islamist view, and so they get killed too. I met with many imams on trips to Nigeria as well as here, and they say if we speak out, we'll be firebombed too. During a visit, 19,000 churches have also been attacked. More than 7,000 have been murdered in this year alone. During my visit to Jos in 2013, I visited many churches that have been firebombed in Jos. And I listened to the survivors and was moved almost to tears, and to tears with some, when they talked about the numbing loss and pain of losing loved ones. And the churches were decimated, each and every one of them, either by cars coming in and plowing everybody and destroying the physical, or by bombs, and of course always the ever-present AK-47. They pleaded with their own government and the world to end the cruelty and violence. And I've been raising it, as have many others ever since. About 5 million Christians have been displaced and forced into internally displaced persons camps within Nigeria and refugee camps at regional and sub-regional borders, according to an Inter-Society report. Open Doors reports, and again, I hope we can finally get beyond just saying nothing's to see here. While Christians used to be vulnerable only to Muslim-majority northern states, this violence continues to spread into the Middle Belt and even further south. The attacks are shockingly brutal. Many believers are killed, particularly men, while women are often kidnapped and targeted for what? Sexual violence, rape, and other abuse. More believers are killed for their faith in Nigeria than anywhere else in the world. These militants also destroy homes, churches, and livelihoods, and many people don't go to school anymore. One estimate is 10,000 schools have been closed due to this violence. The Nigerian government has a fundamental constitutional obligation to protect its own citizens, yet the brutal reality is that the perpetrators of these crimes operate with impunity. The lack of accountability sends a chilling message that the lives of Christian farmers and their families are expendable. This failure has rightfully been called out by the President of the United States, President Trump, and Secretary of State Rubio. The United States must not stand by idly. I've introduced resolutions, and others have been introduced as well. Res 82, I had done that previously on 82, asking that the Biden administration, we had an interesting conversation and debate on that resolution. It did pass 26 to 21. And part of the argument that was made by Mr. Meeks and my very distinguished colleague to my left is that it's the President and the Secretary of State that needs to make that call, not us. I think we can encourage something. That's what it did. But nevertheless, now they made the call. And I think we need to, double down and try to stop this. Res 860, which I've introduced, also calls on conditioning U.S. foreign assistance, and it must be tied to progress from the Nigerian government in preventing persecution, prosecuting perpetrators, and protecting all communities. Second, it would provide direct humanitarian assistance, especially the faith-based groups working on the ground in the Middle Belt. What we're hearing is that it's not getting through. People are hungry, so we need to make sure that they're helped. And third, we must impose targeted sanctions pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Act, using visa bans and access freezes against individuals and entities responsible for these gross human rights abuses. President Trump, as I conclude, said, Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria. The United States cannot stand by while atrocities are happening in Nigeria.